Hi there, I'm Mitch. I'm the guy who writes the tools for the Lights Right. Occasionally I get an email from someone that runs one of the tools that creates masks of one kind or another, and they'll tell me that they've run the action and nothing happens. The image looks the same. Well, truth be told, that's what's supposed to happen. The TLR Edge and Surface Masks action set, the TLR Professional Mask Toolkit, TLR Saturation Mask, they all create masks, but then they rely on the user to know how to take those masks and use them to adjust the photograph. For this example, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run one of the actions in the TLR Saturation Mask action set, and I'm going to run the High Saturation Mask action. This is a rather sophisticated action. It predates the Vibrance slider in Photoshop CS4 and Lightroom 2, so it's very helpful if you're running a version of Photoshop earlier than CS4 and you want to reduce the saturation for features in the image. In particular, when you don't want to reduce the saturation for everything in your photograph, but instead you want to have a bigger effect on features in the photograph that are highly saturated. I created this action set to solve a problem. Early digital SLRs had a tendency to burn out the highlights on photographs, and often they would burn out just one channel. For example, with the early Canon DSLRs, cameras like the D30, the D60, they had a tendency to burn out the red channel. And if that happened with these yellows, they would take on an orange appearance. So I created this action in order to be able to create a mask that would be lightest where the saturation was the strongest and would be darker where saturation was less. That way then I could apply a saturation adjustment and reduce the more brightly saturated colors, but leave the less saturated colors largely unchanged. And then you can see down here there's also a low saturation mask action, and that flips it around. So let's go ahead and let's run this action. Now, people who write to me and tell me they've run the action and it's had no effect on the photograph, if they're talking about a visible effect on the photograph, they're absolutely right. To get to a visible effect on the photograph, we have to go over to the Channels palette. And there we can see that it did create a mask, a high saturation mask. Now, technically, this is what we call an alpha channel in Photoshop. I'm going to show you in a moment how we can use the high saturation mask to reduce the more brightly saturated colors in this photograph. I know it's kind of hard to see here on this little bitty thumbnail, but you can see that the more brightly saturated colors are the yellow peppers and the red peppers. These purple peppers are less saturated. Now, the easiest way to use the saturation mask is to take and create a selection. All we have to do is hover over top of the channel, and then on the PC, you would use the Control key, or on the Mac, you would use the Command key, hold that down, and click. And now we've taken the mask, and we've made it into a selection. We can now go back to the Layers palette, create a new layer, or better yet, we can simply create an adjustment layer. We'll go over here, we'll use the Hue Saturation, create a new Hue Saturation layer, and you'll notice that it's already been added as a layer mask to this new layer. And so this means that any adjustments that we make now to hue and saturation are going to have a much more visible impact where the mask is light or white than it will where the mask is dark. With a layer mask, the rule is always white reveals and black conceals. So we can go up here to saturation now, and we can reduce it, and I'm going to pull this down to some ridiculously low level, and you will notice that the visual impact is much greater on the yellows and on the reds than it is on the purple peppers or the wood in the background. Go ahead, bring it back up to 0. Now, we're not just limited to doing hue and saturation adjustments. We could use the same mask, for example, with a levels adjustment, or simply from here, just simply reduce the lightness. Again, you can see that the impact is much greater on those highly saturated peppers than it is on the less saturated peppers. Go back to 0. It would be reasonable to ask why I didn't just go ahead and add a layer mask to the current layer when you use one of these tools. And I'd like to think my answer is reasonable too, and that is, I didn't know whether or not the layer you wanted to work with would necessarily be the active layer at the time. Moreover, sometimes we want to recycle masks. We want to use the same edge mask or the same surface mask or maybe even the same saturation mask and use it for 2 or 3 different operations. Well, it's wasteful to go ahead and create the same mask over and over again. Any of the Lights Right tools that create a mask stop at the point of creating the alpha channel and labeling it. They don't go the extra step of taking that mask and then making it a layer mask on a particular layer. I make tools for a wide range of users. Some of the tools are designed for people who have very little experience with Photoshop. Some of the tools, and this is particularly the case for tools that involve masks, are really designed for users who have more intermediate to advanced experience. people who understand what alpha channels are, how to create a selection from them, and then how to attach that to a layer as a layer mask. I certainly hope this brief video will help you use the tools. And if you don't have a lot of experience working with channels, if they still seem kind of confusing to you, then I suggest you get a good book on Photoshop. I can recommend some very good authors to you. Deke McClellan has some good books on Photoshop. So does Scott Kelby. So does Dave Cross. So does Matt Kloskowski. So does Martin Evening. Get any of their books on Photoshop basics. And in the case of several of those authors, they even have some books that focus right in on channels in Photoshop. And read more about alpha channels and how you can use them to improve your digital photography. I'm Glenn Mitchell from thelightsright.com. Cheers.